Hey everyone, I'm Shane Brisson from Armchair Rockstar. Welcome back to Rock and Roll What Ifs. Today, in honor of Halloween, we'll be pondering a fun one. What if Glenn Danzig never left the Misfits? Today, we're joined by my partner in crime and editor-in-chief, Corey Knowles, and our resident rock punk buff, Chris Milades.
Hey, man.
Chris is a journalist who has spent years covering the music industry and chasing great punk around New York City. Chris, I've worked on your stuff for years, designing it. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Let's dive in.
Likewise, Shane. Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on. I appreciate it.
For sure, man. For sure. Excited about this one. I think it's going to be fun, especially being Halloween.
Okay.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it's the season for the Misfits, it looks like.
Chris, you're the guest. Please fire the opening salvo.
Well, I got into punk rock when I was probably 14 or 15, late middle school, early high school. I'd go to a lot of shows. In total, I've been to like over maybe 150, 200 punk rock shows throughout my tenure in the scene. But I've been covering music journalism and been doing that since 2003. That's how I broke into writing. Eventually in 2007, I broke into news writing, but through and through, I've been a punk rocker through all those years, and it's really helped to motivate me in what I do. And as far as the music journalism stuff, that's not really ever left. It's always sort of been in my blood. So whenever I can inject music into my writing, I go for it.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well, it's good to be back again this week. Chris, we're really glad to have you here, man. Chris, just for those of you who don't know, for years, Chris and I have worked together, and he's always been my resident punk rock guru. When I have a question, I call, and Chris sends me a band and says, check these out. And then I get lost in a rabbit hole for a few days, and we go back and forth.
Yeah, that'll happen. Sorry about inflicting that on you, because not all those bands are winners.
Hey, you have to listen to some garbage to get to the good stuff. There's a lot of garbage in the world today. There's good music. It's just buried.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man. Well, so let's see. What if Danzig never left the Misfits? It's an interesting topic. Chris, what's the first thing comes to your mind? If Danzig was still around, what's the first thought that hits you?
So the thing with Danzig and the Danzig era Misfits, as far as that band is concerned, that iteration of the band, the original lineup, for me, they're a quintessential punk rock group. It's essential listening. If you're just getting into punk rock music, or you're looking for a band to sort of be your gateway into that genre, the Danzig era stuff is the way to go. You have to start there. They did something different, being that they were kind of horror themed. A lot of their music was pulling from various horror movies, a lot of old, Hitchcock with Psycho and Return of the Fly and stuff like that. But the question I think you asked was, what would it look like if Glenn never left? I think the band would have gotten a lot tighter and more proficient. I think that they probably still would have settled on subject matter that dealt with the macabre and occultism, which Danzig was really hip on. But I'm not sure that they would have endured like a band like the Rolling Stones or even the Ramones that had multiple albums and didn't disband until '96. I would think that they would really hone in and become better players. I think Danzig, behind the helm, would have written some really clever, dark, edgy punk rock, and that may have continued the band through the years, but I'm not quite sure how long that would have been, because I knew that Danzig had always had a bigger vision outside the band. So
yeah, because it goes from there into Sam Hain, and then his most successful music as just as Glenn Danzig.
Sure.
The solo music. I can't help but wonder, one of the first things that comes to my mind when I think about it is, would his solo career have still happened? Would at some point he have branched off, even if they remained together as a band? Would he still have, I wonder, dived in and done it? Because there was a lot of great music, man. There's Twisted Pain, there's Mother, obviously, which everybody knows, Dirty Black Summer. You're getting in, there's so much great stuff that came in those first two or three albums, especially, that But it's interesting to me because he keeps a dark theme, but basically moves over to metal.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely more of a hard rock sort of metal post-punk feel on his later albums for sure. And you kind of saw that carry through with the Misfits. I mean, when they dropped Earth AD, which, Glenn had lamented, he hated the mixing on it, he hated how his vocals sounded. But that was unlike anything they did in the past. I mean, you even looking at the compilations like Legacy for Brutality or Collections 1 and 2, obviously Walk Among Us, Static Age. When it came time to release and to work on Earth AD, it was much thrashier. There's no denying it. It wasn't so much the punk rock that you heard in the past. It was more polished, a lot thrashier, and I feel like, and I mean at the time he wrote 2 songs that during that era specifically for Sam Hain, but he included it on Earth AD. I think just for sheer virtue that there weren't enough songs to round out the album, but you saw that progression that he was taking. So, so yeah, I think that kind of led him into, going into more heavier music, which is evident on the self-titled stuff or the solo stuff, I should say.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember, I guess my first exposure to Danzig solo music would have been the video for Twist of Cain on Headbangers Ball back on MTV, way the hell back. And back when MTV had music and it was great. The good music was relegated to 2.5 hours or 3 hours on a Saturday night into Sunday morning. But it was I remember the video for Twist of Cain and Mother, and I remember I went out, picked it up on cassette. But when I did, I also bought completely with no knowledge of what it was. I bought Earth AD at the same time. We had a mall we used to go to about 40 miles from the house when it was time to get music, because I grew up out in the country, and we went to Camelot Music in the mall. Do you remember Camelot? Shane remembers Camelot Music.
I'm on the East Coast. So I got no idea.
Oh yeah, you probably didn't have them in New York.
We had Tower Records, we had Virgin.
Camelot.
We had Camelot and Disc Jockey were the 2 big mall record stores.
We had Sam Goody. Was that over there by you guys as well? Okay, cool.
We had Sam Goody.
We had The Wall. This is kind of dating myself, but we had The Wall, and then we had Sam Goody, and there may have been another. But Tower Records for me was huge. Every weekend I'd go and check out a show, and then like at night I'd head over to Tower Records and just go through the bins and just grab a CD almost every weekend. Most of it usually of the punk rock variety. Obviously, that's kind of been my bread and butter. So.
It was, for me, one of the things that was interesting about picking those albums up is I knew what to expect in the Danzig solo record. I felt like I knew what I was getting there. And with Earth AD, I had no idea. And when I first put it in, I was probably 8. I was a kid. I started buying music really young. Right. And I would say, I remember putting it in and thinking that it sounded like absolute shit, but it was really cool. I was like, why does it sound so bad? I guess I just never, at that age, I had never been exposed to any punk that was, recorded with a dangling microphone in a metal garage or something.
Right. No, hell yeah. I love it. Despite the shitty recording, I mean, I love all that stuff. And like I mentioned earlier with Collections 1 and 2 that Danzig decided to drop, as well as Legacy of Brutality, like the quality just wasn't there. And on Collection 1, it sounded like they recorded the entire album in a tin can. I mean, it was just bad. But I find myself returning to it often and really enjoying the tunes. So that's got to say something about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, now I do. I listen to him regularly, love the music. I watched an interview the other night where it wasn't really an interview. Henry Rollins was talking to someone and someone was recording it. And he was talking about their 12 hits from hell and about how the mix was so much better, but Danzig didn't want it to come out to ever be released. He said, you listen to the normal one and it sounds like, he's singing into a keg or something. It's like the drums are out front, the guitars are buried, and the singer's in the middle or something. Like the mix is just some strange choices.
Right.
And it was interesting stuff. Do you think just an interesting dive? Do you think the super short window of time where the Misfits existed and put out an album, do you think that plays a role in their influence and how it worked? That it was this super short, super quick, it came together. Do you think that taints how we, I mean, not taints, but changes how we see them if we were looking at them as a band that's been around for 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, the Misfits have had an undeniable influence when it comes to, the early 80s hardcore scene, where I think they had, by 77, when they started getting serious about writing, the Ramones had already dropped 3 releases and were touring the world relentlessly. But when it came to the Misfits, I feel like they were in a pocket of time that was just at the very right moment. It was a powder keg, and it was going from punk rock as we knew it in the 70s, which by 80s hardcore standards was very tame, and just the level of aggression and energy that the Misfits really promoted and really like exuded, I thought was perfect for them. And that short period of time, I think for a lot of people may have felt like it was a flash in the pan, and I guess in some ways it was, but it really captured the energy of that moment in time. And again, one of the questions we're pondering is what would have happened if it had continued. I don't know if there's a perfect answer for that question, but that's certainly something that we can expound upon as we continue our discussion.
Well, would they have been seen through the same eyes if they had continued?
By the fans?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got some insight on that. When it comes to just punk rock in general, and this can probably translate to other genres as well, but you're looking at 2 categories of people. I mean, with punk rock, it's always been a youth movement. Rock and roll has always been a youth movement. So when you get down into it, if you're a music enthusiast and you love the genre, either you're a lifer and you're going to the shows and you're reliving those moments and you love the live music and will go out of your way, fucking, get out of work early just to check out a gig. Those are the lifers. Then there are the others that start young and sort of use punk rock as a tool for maybe finding an identity or feeling like there's some sort of community, and then they leave. So I think in the case with the Misfits, you're always going to have those diehards that would have stuck with them if they had continued releasing material with Glenn Danzig as the main songwriter. I think those people would have endured, and those other people that decided just that it wasn't for them, or maybe they outgrew the sound, or they were no longer interested in punk, they'd leave. But an entire generation of new fans would have taken over for sure. That's just the ebb and flow when it comes to punk rock.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
that makes sense. They're one of the most well-marketed bands on earth as far as gear goes, and stickers and hats and shirts and lunchboxes and Halloween costumes, and it just goes on and on. And I was thinking today while we were preparing for this, I kept thinking, I'll bet they've made more money on merchandising than they've ever made on music.
Oh yeah. And Jerry's still fucking pissed because Glenn has half of that. He takes half from all the merch sales, and Jerry takes the other half.
Though, aren't they technically? I mean, they did some shows. They're still together technically, aren't they? They did some shows last year, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was 2016. They played their reunion show at Riot Fest, and then that turned into a couple of gigs throughout the country, and then they eventually stopped. And I think they did it for 2 reasons. One, and the most obvious one, is the love of money. Everyone wants a paycheck. And that's a bit cynical of me to say that, but at the same time, you've got that instant cash flow that is coming. But I think when it comes to aging rock stars or musicians, is at some point they have to sit down as a group and be like, hey, listen, there's going to be a point in time where we just can't do this shit anymore. Like our backs are going to go, my voice is going to go, my hands. I mean, if you look at Lemmy during his later years, he could barely hold his bass.
Oh man!
So there reaches a point where it's like either we do this now or it's never going to happen. And I think that kind of mindset or that thinking was definitely present in those discussions with the band.
Like there was maybe always an idea that one of these days we're going to do this. It's going to be really cool. We're going to make a mountain of money, and carry us through our older years. And, you know, and that's a big thing now. I can't help but wonder how much the decline in publishing revenue from the streaming world played into that as well. Because, you know, I mean, we're at a point now where it's, you know, hundreds of streams to make up for what they make on one vinyl record as a band in sales. And there are a lot of older bands on the road these days. If you haven't noticed, been a lot of cancellations this year too, as a result of all of these older guys touring. And I think a lot of that has to do with we're seeing the first generation of aging rockers who don't have the luxury of publishing royalties to survive on in their old age.
Yeah. But then it's weird too. I mean, Bob Dylan sold his entire catalog. I think there's been a couple of other musicians, prolific musicians, that have done the same. It's a bit of a shame. But
Motley Crue did. I mean, like for $1 billion, it was huge.
Yeah. I mean, they're providing for themselves the rest of their life, but more so it's for the families. Obviously, they want to make sure that they're taken care of. That's really what it is.
For sure. Something else that crossed my mind in thinking of the Misfits is when you think of them being broken up and the role they played in bands like early Metallica. I mean, Metallica probably gave the Misfits as much recognition and notoriety as anybody in those early years. Because I mean, you know, 84 they're covering, 85 they're covering Last Caress, Green Hell, and there's one more. They did Die Die My Darling later. That is
right.
Really
that's true.
version.
I forgot about that one.
But when I think of that, I don't just think of them influencing punk bands. I also think of how that got into horrorcore and stuff, like bands like ICP and the Ghetto Boys, even, or let's say Cannibal Corpse, Cancer. When you get into some of the like darker lyrical themes on like Astro Zombies and stuff like that, that get a little more gory, I can't help but wonder if that is the music that opened the door for those kind of bands.
Yeah, I think, in all honesty, I'm sure it was an influence. Just because the Misfits have had such a staying power. I mean, through merchandising alone, the Crimson Ghost is something that is hugely recognizable. I mean, everyone knows it. They might not know the meaning behind it if they're particularly young, but they can identify it. And so I think what you're saying is true. I think that they've helped to influence a lot of bands. There have been a lot of bands that have a direct influence, like Blitzkid and some of them. But I think the legacy of the Misfits has endured. You've got many bands that deal with horror elements that I'm sure can be traced back to the band. They've made such an impact on the music industry and on underground music in general that I can't help but think that they are responsible for a lot of these horror themed bands as well. So
and they did that from very small clubs in New York. They weren't on the cover of Circus magazine and things like that. Talking about
they
not on
barely left
radio.
They barely left the tri-state.
Yeah.
For the most part. I mean, they're from Lodi, New Jersey. They would do the tri-state circuit, and that's what they would stick to primarily until they branched off. I think they may have done some dates in Canada and elsewhere, but for the most part, they were a New Jersey, New York band, and that's where they stuck.
Nice.
Pretty amazing, the lasting legacy for just sticking to the tri-state area, though.
It's wild, and I think that's actually a good question. You know, what would have happened in terms of their support and their staying power had they decided to venture outside of the East Coast?
Right.
I mean, to my knowledge, they never
go?
did any international stuff, with the exception of England, where they were famously jailed, and that's how London Dungeon came to be, which I think is pretty awesome.
That's a great story.
For grave robbing, apparently. I don't know if you knew that, but that was they were in a graveyard. They went grave robbing, and they were booked.
Yeah,
the
history lesson you guys have been giving me and sending me. So yeah, great story.
But yeah, again, that just begs the question. You know, have they really pushed to get out there and to tour relentlessly? I'm wondering what kind of impact that may have had on their audience and for the band themselves.
And I mean, who would they have even toured with? Like what band do you pair the Misfits with in
Oh, dude.
85, 86? Who do you
I
stick
mean,
with,
listen.
and do you roll them through the Midwest?
So Jerry only was really tight with Henry Rollins, who at the time was with Black Flag. And
Yeah.
when it comes to hardcore, like you have to realize too, is that, you know, a lot of it can be credited for a lot of the East Coast punk rock or the East Coast hardcore bands that were coming through. But like
Yeah.
even like Washington, D.C. with the Bad Brains, that really set things off in New York City when it came to
Yeah.
like really promoting the hardcore movement. But if you look on the West Coast, you had bands like the Germs, Circle Jerks, Black Flag, X. Like there was a lot happening there too. So my whole thing is like, why didn't they just play a lot more dates on the West Coast? There was certainly an audience for it, but no. So Danzig had spent a lot of time talking with Henry Rollins. I'm sure if they had any touring mates, the obvious ones in the hardcore movement would probably have been Black Flag,
Probably Black Flag.
the Germs, maybe Circle Jerks. The thing with the Germs, though, where they were very unreliable because their frontman Darby Crash was always hopped up on fucking something. He would never sing into his microphone. All of the shows would end in a disaster with somebody getting arrested. So yeah, it was different on the LA coast, on the West Coast from what we were doing here in New York. But yeah, I think they probably would have done very successful touring with those West Coast bands and bringing them over here out east, you know?
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. The same thing for those West Coast bands coming out and hitting New York.
Yep.
You know, that was a weird 80s dynamic thing, and it carried over into rap later. You had this East Coast versus West Coast.
It's true.
That I think as we've become a more globally connected world in the years since, thanks to the internet and whatnot,
Sure.
I think that's kind of gotten rid of some of that. You don't hear those things like you used.
It's definitely broke down walls for sure. And I think there was some kind of a competition too with like West Coast punk and hardcore bands compared to what was going on the East Coast. But I think both scenes were similar in terms of just their playability. The fact that a lot of them just kept it very simple, very bare bones, direct to the point. But they're different in style. If you really listen to them side by side, they're very different. I mean, if you're looking at like the SoCal bands, like Agent Orange, for example, that
Very
had like
from
this
like a
surf rock sort of feel to it. They
Yeah.
covered Miserlou, which was amazing.
Yeah.
Like they definitely had that kind of feel. And I mean, who could blame them? You know, they're in Orange County, so they've got the ocean, they've got the beautiful beaches. It's a different vibe than what we're getting out here because the Atlantic Ocean is absolutely disgusting.
Those
And there's not a
unfortunate
single beach you want to
bastards in
go
Orange
to on
County.
the East Coast. What's that?
Said those unfortunate bastards in Orange County. It must be terrible.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But they had some great songs, man. I loved Agent Orange, and this is actually a bit of a tie-in, but I saw the Misfits, well, back when Jerry only decided to recruit Marky Ramone on drums and Des Candina on guitar. Agent Orange opened for them. I saw them probably I'm in Suffolk County, Long Island. So I saw them in Nassau. It's about a 45-minute ride. They play this club. Agent Orange comes on. I was a huge fan. So was my friend. And they got booed off stage. And everybody in attendance, all these young kids had Misfit shirts on. They had the skeleton gloves and all that sort of thing. And I'm just like, how the hell do you boo Agent Orange off stage? And then, of course, the Misfits came on. Everyone lost their fucking minds. But it wasn't the same. It was the first time I saw the Misfits on stage, and it was just a cover act. And this is something that we've talked behind the scenes about, Corey, was that, you know, Des would play his Black Flag tunes, and Marky would do some Ramones, and Jerry would do the Misfits stuff and trying his best Glenn Danzig impersonation, which fell flat in a lot of ways. But to Jerry's credit, he's kept the whole thing going all these years. And I think that had he not, the chance for a reunion may or may not have been possible. I mean, who knows?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. You know, I mean, he carried the torch for sure.
He did.
You know, when a lot of guys went, and you see that a lot now, though. There's several 80s bands like LA Guns. Speaking of which, Steve Riley died yesterday, or day before yesterday. So that was part of there are two LA Guns, there are two Great Whites, there are two Skid Rows. All of these bands that broke up over the years, but they're all still touring on the same music. One of them gets the real name, and the other one gets Jack Russell's Great White or something.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, well, the
that's-
same thing happened to an extent with the Misfits. I mean, there was a 13-year-long legal battle between Jerry Only, Doyle, and Glenn Danzig over the rights to the name. So when they settled, you know, Jerry had the right to play as under the Misfits moniker. He was entitled to half of the merch sales, and he's continued the band. But I just can't get over the sad fact that he's trying his best to croon and to sound like Danzig, and it's just not working out.
it's just not working.
It really isn't. And I mean, some of the stuff that he's put out with Dez and Robo, I mean, it's just scraping at the bottom of the barrel sort of thing. They're trying to use the horror tie-ins and do their best to keep it going, but it falls on deaf ears in a lot of ways. I mean, people that I continue to talk to in the punk rock scene, like they're like, what's the Misfits? I stopped listening in 98.
Yeah. That's sad. You know, it's funny. Last night, as kind of part of prep for this, I decided I wanted to listen to Project 1950.
Right.
And here's the deal, in my opinion. Is it a fun punk record with some cool songs? Absolutely. Is it the Misfits, though?
No,
No,
not at all.
it's just not.
Not at all. There's a funny story with the whole 1950, the Project 1950 was that Jerry Only was a huge fan of the NFL. And he in the Project 1950 they covered Great Balls of Fire, and it was played in stadiums across the country, and that was like his crowning achievement. He always wanted to do it, so he succeeded. And this is where we have a difference of opinion, Corey. I think Project 1950 was fucking trash. I hated it. I couldn't fucking stand it. I really couldn't.
Through the eyes of a lifetime Misfits diehard, though.
Wow.
Where for me, I've never been the diehard, but I do dig the music. I like Danzig for many, many years. But I never knew as much of the history as you do and followed them to the extent that you have.
Right.
So for me, it was like, it's okay.
It's a fun little record.
It's not the fucking Misfits.
Yeah, just if you were to take just the Misfits name off of it, fine.
And
It's
just
passable.
you'd be like, that's a cool record. It's okay.
It's not bad. I mean, what they had O'Donnell, which, by the way, I mean, Richie Valens was one of the greats, and to take a really slow, kind of heartfelt, romantic song and just up tempo the shit out of it and turn it into a punk cover, that's where I thought it was sacrilege. Honestly, when I was listening to that, I'm like, how the fuck did he ruin such a perfect song? And he did. So there you have it.
Oh shit! Do you think there's any chance that, given the fact that immediately after the Misfits, Danzig's going into Sam Hain, and it's taking this metal shift, his musical direction as a songwriter is taking this shift into metal from punk.
Right.
You think if he sticks around, do you think the Misfits kind of push that direction?
Yeah. It's like I said, I think with Earth AD, you heard them get a lot thrashier.
Yeah.
Because bands like Pantera were coming up, Anthrax, Metallica was becoming bigger and bigger. So I think
Exodus,
I think just part of that was just this natural progression. I think that Danzig always wanted to stay relevant and to stay fresh. And I think to an extent, that's why he got rid of so many of his bandmates, because he wanted the best of the best.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why he decided to just abandon Jerry Only and Doyle was because he felt like they were not good musicians.
They were not the best of the best. Yeah.
Yeah, it just wasn't what he was looking for. So he thought Sam Hain would have been something different, and it was. And I appreciated him covering or doing. It wasn't so much a cover; it was more like a remix of Horror Business, which is one of my all-time favorite Misfits songs.
Great one.
But they came out with Horror Biz on the first Sam Hain record. They changed the arrangement of the song. Musically, it was a bit different. I don't know if you've heard it, Corey, but it's absolutely fantastic.
No.
But yeah, you saw there where it was still kind of horror punky with songs like Macabre and I'm trying to think what else I could think of off that same hand record. But anyhow, you saw a shift in taste when it came to the kind of stuff they were putting out. And eventually it turned into Danzig being the star attraction and releasing music under his name. And then, the rest is history, I think. When it came to his releases, he was doing what he wanted to do, what he thought he always wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I think to an extent he excelled at it. There's people that really respect what he did after Sam Hain, but I never really got into it.
I feel like Sam Hain was a necessary step between the two projects.
I
Listening
think so
to them,
too, yeah.
listening to them in hindsight, like you can see we're going from straight punk, and then there's this transition phase where it's like he's figuring out what he's doing, and
Yeah, it was
and
like punk,
then
then hardcore, then thrash, then
Yeah.
kind of like post-punk. I mean, it was kind of all over the place.
And where would you guys place his solo efforts as far as genre? Do you still think it follows that, Macabre
I would say
or horror?
something I would
Go ahead,
that
Corey.
it still has some aspects of that, but not nearly to the extent that the Misfits did. There's no gore. Honestly, it went a little more satanic by the second album, if anything.
That it did.
But what I will say is that when Danzig's first album released, other people weren't doing shit like what was on that record. It was unique. It was slow. It was heavy. It was all closer to stoner doom metal than it was to thrash even. And I mean, it really wasn't thrash. It didn't get that heavy, but it was definitely not like radio rock. You weren't going to hear it on. Well, if you did, never mind. You did hear Mother on the radio.
Mother was everywhere.
Mother got significant time on the rock stations down here.
Almost
Just when
definitely.
you were
Up here on
sick of
the
it,
East Coast too. Yeah.
Oh, ad nauseum, dude. It was like, okay, I've heard enough.
You know what's odd is I could still put that single on and still enjoy it. It's
No,
weird
like,
for me.
now I'd enjoy the hell out of it.
Okay, yeah.
At that time, it was just
At the time,
really
yeah, it was a bit of a slog.
knocking the shit out of it on the radio and whatnot.
Oh yeah.
It's like,
You know what though? I'll bet you Mother's still what's keeping the lights on for Glenn Danzig at this point in life.
I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the one that catapulted him into, I will not say superstardom. He's not a superstar. That's not correct. But it
There might be some
definitely
people who disagree with you
a
though.
different level. Yeah, maybe, maybe I'm being a little critical, but
my last question was actually kind of a perfect segue though. Would the Misfits lyrical themes have delved deeper into the dark horror imagery with his continued involvement?
Yeah, well, I think later in life it came out that Danzig was an avid reader, and he liked to read about occultism, the parallels between the occult and Nazi Germany, really weird, obscure stuff. He said that he claims to have a book that has missing pages from the Bible that depicted Jesus Christ during his early years that weren't documented in the New Testament. And he talked about how Jesus was actually evil at a young age and would torment his peers. So he says that's in the Bible. He's very sure of himself that was Jesus when he was a teenager. He would inflict torture upon other people. So who knows?
I would
but I
pay
think
to watch Glenn Danzig debate Jerry Falwell.
Right, but taking those elements of occultism and this weird spin on religion, I think the subject matter or just the lyrical output of the Misfits would have very much stayed in that horror vein. And it may have gotten even deeper because I think when it came to like some of their early stuff or just a lot of their songs, they were really pulling from old B-movie horror tropes. That was really where they were going with their stuff. It didn't really deal much with the whole occultism, although I haven't heard a lot of Danzig solo stuff. I'm sure a lot of that may have crept in because during that time he was very much into all that weird stuff. Also the New World Order and the Freemasons, like he was deep into that lore. So yeah. So who knows? But
yeah. That's so interesting. That was where I was about to go with it, was that those early years were almost comic book horror. in a those B movies, those old science fiction movies with the flying saucers,
Right.
teenagers from Mars kind of shit. And what did they say? I read the other day that was kind of believed to be pulled from maybe Invasion of the Body Snatchers and something else. I can't remember. But it was talking about a couple of movies they felt like a lot of that era stuff really came from specifically.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and then you had the song again, horror business. I'm bringing it back up again. Some people thought it was his reaction to Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen killing themselves, or Nancy Spungen being murdered. But if you listen to lyrics, I mean, Psycho 78, 12 o'clock, don't be late, all this horror business, like the mirrors are black for you. It very much felt like he was pulling from the Hitchcock film.
Yeah.
But some might argue that it was based or rooted more in reality. I don't know.
Interesting. Do you think, suppose they continue on, Danzig's writing ability is growing, do you guys think there's any chance they would have been more commercially successful over an additional stretch, if they went on for another 5 years, 10, 20, or I don't believe for a minute that the Misfits would have stayed together from 1977 or whatever to today. Like, I feel like they're one of those bands that every 5 or 6 years they'd have maybe done a tour together or something to fund their other projects after they broke up, one of those kind of things, The
only kind of thought I have on that question, Corey, is it goes back to what you guys were talking about, is maybe if they had toured the West Coast more.
Yeah.
They would have gotten that more exposure.
Yeah, and I think that would
there were the Southern California, those scenes out there, so hard to gauge. I think they would have at least gotten that much more exposure.
Yeah, and I think that really would have opened them up to more career opportunity as well, because those old punk rock bands and the hardcore bands from the West Coast that I mentioned earlier, like, they had a lot of staying power for a lot of them did, and some of them were signed to majors, so who knows what could have happened. I do know that when Mercury bought out the name for Glenn Danzig's record label, which was Blank, I believe, first.
Yes.
Yeah. When they decided to do that, he sold it to him in exchange for studio time. So that studio session turned out to be Static Age, which was essentially their first record, but it wasn't released until '96, which is crazy.
It is crazy.
But he was, Danzig, to his credit, was shopping it around. He knew that, the Ramones signed with Sire Records, which was a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. They knew that they had kind of a similar sound, and that was stripped down rock and roll. It was a lot of like real energy that they thought would have captivated an audience, similar to what the Ramones had done at CBGB's in New York City. But it just never happened. No one wanted Static Age. No one wanted anything to do with the band. So it's weird. I mean, I think if they continued on as a band, I guess your question is valid. Would they have gone on to find commercial success? And I think that's a very hard question to answer, honestly. I mean, what do you think, Shane?
I don't know about so much commercial success. I just think they would have gotten even more exposure. Hit the DC scene. Jam down there, Black Flag, Minor Threat, right? Bands like that. So,
I think for me, the key is whether they just stayed in the New York area. If they stay in the New York area, they are what they are. And then that's probably what they would have stayed, in my opinion.
Right.
Because they're not on MTV. They're not on the radio. They're not in the magazines. They're not in any of the like more mainstream stuff that would have spread their good word a lot farther. I mean, by being underground music, you're
sort of confined
destined
to
for a
space.
more difficult marketing journey, and but I think if they got out, I think if they were touring Europe. I don't know how well their music would have gone over in Europe. It's an
Mhm.
interesting thought, but because British punk was very different. I feel like British punk was, there's this interview I watched a few nights ago of,
Yeah.
it's not an interview, it's a panel, but Johnny Rotten and Marky Ramone are, trying not to come
Yes.
to blows. And one of the things that they're talking about is Marky's like, we were having fun. We wanted to make fun music. And he's like, and Johnny Rotten was like, yeah, but you're not dealing with the politics. You're not dealing with the things that Johnny Rotten would argue are what punk is. And I can't help but wonder, because what seemed to come out of the UK was so much more serious.
Yeah. Well, economically, they were doing very, very poorly. But then if you're looking at 80s hardcore, I mean, we had Reagan. So
Yeah.
there's that.
Yeah, I mean,
food for hardcore.
and like
Oh,
the
absolutely.
The Sex Pistols and the Clash were also dealing with local politics going just within their regions.
Sure.
So, that was a trying time for them there. But Chris, you're right. Yeah, we had Reagan.
Yeah. But I
Which
think
is-
more so with like the American side, it was just, I mean, the Ramones icons themselves, they looked at what was hip to, or like what was popular on top 40, what were the big bands, and a lot of it was disco, and how a lot of youth or young people just viewed it as being this this very glamorous, or this lifestyle that they weren't leading. They weren't interested in the Bee Gees. They weren't interested in all these disco acts. And so I think a lot of what they were rebelling against was the current mainstream music market, along with just feeling like they didn't belong anywhere because they didn't dare step foot in a disco club. And a lot of these young kids didn't want to go and see these big arena rock bands that made it a point to declare that there was a clear separation between artist and fan. Really, what punk rock was in the beginning, and what it's continued to be, is a communal experience where you have the artist and the fans, and they're all on the same level. Whereas if you were to see a band like AC/DC, not to knock them, but there's no way you're going to get backstage and or shoot the shit with them after the show.
No.
It would just never happen. But you take any punk rock band there ever was, and that was always on the table. And that's why I like punk rock as much as I do, and that's why I think it's really endured all these years as well.
Yeah, and some of those guys might have hopped off the front of the stage at the end of the show. Not even going to the back. I mean, I've watched a bunch of footage that was so, you look at Iggy Pop, you look at Henry Rollins back in the Black Flag days. I mean, it was very personal. It was very authentic.
Yeah.
Which
it was
is
in your face for sure.
Me on to it as an older guy now, in my 40s. That authenticity is what I have really been craving, because that's what I don't hear on the radio when you get in the car. That's what you're not hearing in soundtracks to television shows and shit like that. That authenticity, that realness, the idea that what you're hearing is the ideas of 3 or 4 people who sat down and they put this song together out of pieces that they made, that they came up with, even if they were shit musicians. And a lot of them were in the beginning, until they so many bands from that era kind of just, you can watch them get better as they go. Even the Ramones, you just watch them get better at their instruments and at songwriting and things over the years. But and I think that might have played a role with the Misfits. That's my gut. If I was going to just take a gamble, I would say much of what we think of as Danzig's solo stuff might have just happened in the Misfits in a slightly different veil of some sort, maybe. But I think if he was growing that way, the Misfits would have just been a part of that too.
Yeah. I don't know if I can completely agree with that, because at the end of the day, like Jerry Only and Danzig are probably both two of the most they have very strong egos, and they always sort of
think a lot of Jerry and Glenn.
So I think if it turned into like the Glenn show, where he just kept Jerry kind of like eschewed to this side and told him, I just play bass on my songs. I think eventually Jerry may have just thrown his hands up in a fit of frustration, and he very well may have quit.
Yeah. Like maybe
And
that
he-
wouldn't
and
have
he
been able
was-
to satisfy Jerry. Yeah.
Yeah, he was one of the faithful members who had been there from the start. Essentially, he was one of the longest running members of the band, next to Danzig. But I mean, I think there would have just been a difference of artistic vision. I think they would have gone their separate ways. The way it played out, I feel like, if without going too much into the 90s and the Michael Graves era of the Misfits, I don't know if we want to touch on that at all. But
Okay.
I think during that time, had Glenn was asked to come back when they decided they were going to start performing under the Misfits again, under the Misfits name
So it's
in
not
the
like he wasn't
90s.
welcome.
He was asked to come back, and he decided to say, no, fuck you. And then they brought in Michael Graves. And I think had Glenn continued, if he had come back for the 90s, then it would have been exactly what you were describing, Corey. It would have been Glenn at the helm, writing darker stuff, with the band being tighter than ever. I mean, they welcomed it, but Glenn wanted nothing to do with it. So they brought on Michael.
Well, even Doyle's joked over the years, like, I only know 5 chords. I know that.
Yeah.
Like, I know exactly what I have to play for our songs. But when you watch footage from 2016 and even more present compared to much, much older footage, you can tell he's got a better grasp of his instrument, and that these guys have grown over the years. Even watching the later, I watched some footage last night from 2016 that was really interesting, and Glenn still sounded good. He's bigger, he's older, he was having a harder time getting around.
Right.
I mean, I say that he seemed a little winded, is what I would say, which I would be too at that age. It's part of life. Running around.
Also, like in the Misfits, they were big workout guys, man.
Yeah,
they looked like wrestlers.
Oh, yeah.
For the most part. They were freakish on stage. But at some point, I think Danzig just decided, well, fuck it, I'm just gonna let go and eat as much chicken wings and hamburgers and pizza as I can. And that's kind of what he looks like. Not to shit on the man and his physical appearance, but I think part of why he's not as good as a performer is because he's simply not taking care of himself.
Yeah, he went punk rock with his diet.
Yeah, exactly.
Fuck the man. I'll eat what I want to eat.
Right. Exactly.
With that said, I've always really dug his voice and the power he sings with. As a performer, he's never been a run around, jump around guy that much. But I always really liked his voice. He put out a couple of Elvis covers, didn't he?
Yeah, Danzig sings Elvis, and it was terrible.
Oh,
another dud. He didn't do any of like the popular hits. It was all obscure stuff, which is fine if you want to add your own aesthetic to the song and sort of make it your own. I mean, that's fine. I welcome stuff like that when it comes to a lot of these artists, but it was just bad.
Just definitively bad.
Just completely unlistenable.
One last question for the panel. Would the Misfits have become a legacy act, continually touring on their classic material, or would they have continued to innovate and evolve their sound?
Corey, you want to take this one first?
I'll take it first, because I imagine Chris will have a lot to say on this subject. A little bit. I mean, obviously, the classic material is always going to be a part of a Misfit show, just like with any big band. I mean, if Metallica shows up and doesn't play Enter Sandman, there'll be a riot outside, and it's going to be the same with the Misfits, with about a dozen 1-minute songs, but
more or less.
And but I do think they would have innovated. I do think if the Misfits, this is of course assuming that they just stayed together and continued playing until they're old, gray, and wobbly. And if that's the case, I think they branched into metal for a while in the late 80s through the mid 90s. And I think they're still doing things after that, but I'm thinking at that point it becomes more of a an album every 4 years or something, and a tour here and there, relying mostly on the classic material, but always having, a new record or a few new songs or something along the way
just to kind of remind folks they're there.
Yeah. Like in the way older bands tour now, they put out a new album, they go on tour, they play 2 songs from the new record because that's all the crowd will tolerate. It's that way when you go see the Stones. It's that way when you go see the Foo Fighters. It's that way at a Guns N' Roses show. Like, yeah, the new stuff's great, but shut the fuck up and get back to Appetite for Destruction, please. Is kind of the fan approach that you see when you're there, and I think that's probably where we'd have seen them go eventually. What do you think, Chris?
I don't know. I don't want to be like a Debbie Downer, but I think they would have gone their separate ways at some point. I think if I had to stick to the criteria and say that they never broke up and they just consistently released music under the Misfits with the original lineup, I'd like to say that, or I think that you've pretty much nailed it, Corey. I think that they may have gotten a bit more diverse in terms of what they were playing as they became better musicians over time. I think that their style would have changed. I think a lot of their fans may have been turned off by some of the new stuff that they wanted to bring into the band, whatever that may have been. I mean, if we continued on with the original timeline and we saw the Misfits get into heavier, more slower, broodier sort of hits, I think a lot of their audience, original audience, those who whoever was left, may have felt like they've been done dirty by the band. So I think a lot of what you said, Corey, rings true. Is that you can pepper in some new material, but really what the fans want to hear from a legacy act is the hits. So I think to an extent, what you said is more or less exactly what I would agree with. I don't think that they would have stayed together all those years personally. I think because of creative differences and an endlessly rotating cast of musicians within the band, I think would have been the nail in the coffin for them. At the same time, I feel like a lot of their campiness and what they were doing at the time that was deemed edgy would have been may have just fallen by the wayside and not been as appreciated by newer audiences. But I think that as a legacy band, if they stuck together, I think we'd be seeing what we're seeing now with Riot Fest and the handful of shows they played around the country. Now they'd get together, they'd play the Danzig era stuff off those 3 albums, and that would have been it.
I think you're probably right. That's kind of what I would say too. That there's just not, people don't want to hear new music from bands. Now there are exceptions to that, like the Stones putting out an album that is actually relevant in their 80s this last month, which is nuts, and it's good. It's good music, and it's the Stones, which is crazy, but most bands aren't the Stones. And I wouldn't want to accuse the Misfits of being either. And if they were, they wouldn't be what they are anyways, is the truth of the matter. That whole that little bit of campiness you talked about is part of what made them so freaking cool.
Yeah, 100%.
Before we get off here, I just want to real quick, what's your favorite Misfits song? If you had to pick one, your Desert Island Misfits song.
Astro Zombies.
Nice. That's a good choice.
It's anthemic. It's fast. It has a great chorus. It's everything you want from a 3-chord punk rock song.
Yeah. It's a great pick. You can't go wrong.
What about you?
For me, damn, it's hard. I keep wanting to say it's either and then list 5 songs is the problem.
Oh, see, that's not fair.
And that's not
that's not right there, Corey.
That's terrible.
You held Chris to one.
I'll be honest, it's probably Last Caress.
Okay.
It was my first Misfits song I ever heard. I heard it on Metallica's 598 Garage Days Revisited EP back in like 85. I didn't hear it in 85, but that album was my first exposure to it. And that song, for like an 8-year-old listening to, I killed your baby today.
Yeah, it's about rape and infanticide. I mean,
Yeah, it's
it is what it is. And the thing is,
Yeah.
it's just catchy as hell.
It
Yeah.
is.
It's upbeat.
catchy,
It's not
fun.
it's not like this downer song. It's very upbeat, but I guess to a fault.
Yeah.
The
And
subject
I
matter
think
is
that's
crazy.
important. I have others that I have, a deeper attachment to as well. But if I'm thinking of the one that makes me want to, like, even at 43 years old, bounce around the kitchen and, pogo to the fridge, I would say that it's Last Caress.
Last Grass. Yeah. For me, Astro Zombies, and I think the two of us would agree as an honorable mention to not forget Attitude.
Yeah, you can't forget Attitude.
Can't forget it.
You can't forget Attitude. You can't forget Teenagers from Mars. I love Teenagers from Mars. That was
Bullet was a big one too, which I really Bullet.
Oh,
The JFK assassination. I
Yeah.
mean, and if you look at the lyrics, yeah, pretty crazy.
oh, Die Die My Darling was a great one.
Yeah.
I Turned Into a Martian, Skulls.
Where Eagles Dare, for God's
Where
sake.
Eagles Dare's another great one. Sure.
Oh, that's
I think we talked about Hybrid Moments being one of my favorite ones as well.
Moments. See, we just did the thing. We've now listed like 11 Misfits songs for our
Yeah, well,
Desert
there
Island.
you go. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we should get 3 because the truth is these songs are all short.
Yes.
We can fit a ton of them on
Even
one
with
blank
3,
set.
you're still under 5 minutes,
Yeah.
or
3
just
is
at
still
about
under
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Probably right about there is what I would say.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Goodness.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone again who joined us today. We appreciate all the views and comments we got on the last What If, and like you guys to please subscribe, like us, hit us up with your comments.
Like us.
Yeah.
You need to
Yes.
be liked.
You don't have to like me, like them, like
Yeah.
Armchair Rockstar.
You need to like him too.
Yeah, I would like to thank
gotta
you.
like our calls.
I would like to thank Chris Milides for joining us again, and look
Thank you
forward
so
to
much,
having
and I
him
appreciate it.
contribute. Yeah, I look forward to having you contribute further to Armchair Rockstar.
I look
on a
forward to
regular
it.
basis. And of course, Corey Knowles. So we hope you'll join us next time. In the meantime, visit the website, armchairrockstar.com, and give us a follow on YouTube and all the other social platforms. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what could have happened if the tables turned as well. So comment away and we'll chime in to keep the discussion going.
Yeah,
Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks, guys.